So welcome everyone to the Derek Tilley podcast, I guess. Today we're going to be visiting with Mary Wolf. Mary is the Soil Health Program Study Leader at the Natural Resources Conservation Service Aberdeen Plant Materials Center in Aberdeen, Idaho. She's been with the Plant Materials Program for the last 5 years in both Idaho and Arizona. And she started with the NRCS back in 2005 as a soil conservationist. She has a master's degree in soil science from Washington State University. And Mary, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Derek. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, so today I wanted to talk about something that's kind of new and exciting in the region, and that is the use of cover crops in agricultural systems in Southeast Idaho. Um, I say it's new, but I think the idea has probably been around for at least a good 50 years, if not much longer, but we're just now seeing a resurgence of it here in the region. So, Mary, if you would, why don't you give me and the listeners a background into the problem before we get into what cover crops actually do. So what are the problems they're trying to address, and what maybe are the signs and symptoms that there is a problem?
Okay, well, here in Eastern Idaho, like everywhere else, there are some big problems with soil health, and that's what people are trying to address with cover crops. And the problems with soil health here are that we have a rotation that's really heavy on very intensive crops. So we have potatoes, we have sugar beets, and we also have winter wheat and beans. And those aren't quite as bad. But when they harvest the potatoes and the sugar beets, the equipment just really digs down into the soil and turns it over. And every time that happens, a couple of things happen. One is that the microbes eat up the organic matter in the soil. And the other is that we go into the fall here with the ground just churned up and bare. And this is a really high wind energy area. There's a lot of wind pretty much all year around. And there's a lot of wind erosion here too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really the problem. And because of when people plant in the spring, like April or May, and then they harvest late in the year in November, October, there's a long period in between there in the wintertime where the soil's just bare.
Okay, right. So you mentioned soil health. So what are some of the possible indicators, or what do you mean by soil health? Is that just soil structure? You mentioned the microbes. So how does that all play together, and what do you as a soil scientist look for to determine whether or not a soil is healthy?
Sure. So when we think about soil, we often don't think about it being an ecosystem, and that's precisely what it is.
Right, right.
It's all full of all sorts of microorganisms, little arthropods, protozoa, just all sorts of critters, fungi. And when the soil is constantly being tilled up and turned over, and when it doesn't have a living roots in it, it the ecosystem just kind of falls apart. And we also don't think that if there's not plants in the ground, the photosynthate from the plants goes into the ground, the sugars, that's what I mean, that the plant makes, goes into the ground and feeds that ecosystem underground. So when you don't have the plants in the soil, you've really cut down on the food that can go to that ecosystem.
So
So
that's kind of a new idea to me. I've heard about it just a little bit, but it wasn't something taught like in my soils class or ecology class. So the plants are actually uh, sacrificing, I guess, some of the sugars that they're producing from photosynthesis and donating it to the system.
yeah, it's symbiotic. It really is, because they're feeding the microbes in return. The microbes, uh, when they break down or as they live their life cycle, they're providing things in return to the plants. And the symbiotic relationship between the plants and these kind of fungi called mycorrhizal fungi that have that kind of grow into the plant roots and out from the plant roots. The plant feeds those fungi with photosynthate sugars, and those fungi kind of act like an extension of the root system, and they bring nutrients and water back to the plant that it couldn't reach otherwise.
So instead of
So
just being an isolated single plant organism, it's got this whole additional network extending its reach into the soil.
exactly. And that understanding of the soil as a particular type of ecosystem it's relatively new.
Yeah, I can imagine. So what about um, soil structural indicators? So if a soil scientist or a soil conservationist goes out to a farm, what's he or she going to look for?
Well, we look for a couple of things out there on the farm. One of them is aggregate stability. And what that means is, do the little clods of soil hold together?
Hmm.
And in a healthy soil, they will hold together because the the different waste materials and breakdown materials that that ecosystem makes in the soil are gluey, and they'll glue soil particles together, and that makes that soil more resistant to erosion. And then the other thing, when we have good aggregate stability, there's a lot of pores in the soil, just little tubes that go down into the soil.
Okay, got
And that means that when it rains, the water's going to go down into that soil and be there available for the organisms that live and grow in the soil instead of just running off and causing even more erosion.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned some of the crops in the typical Idaho rotation. Potatoes are obviously the big one here. Um, and I can imagine that's pretty, pretty intense operation to dig all those potatoes out of the ground. That's going to be pretty damaging to the soil ecosystem. Um, what other aspects of like crop rotations and the management practices, harvesting, that kind of thing, what goes into the destruction or degradation of the soil health?
Well, um, a lot of the preparation work is labor intensive and tillage intensive too.
Uh-huh.
So
Right.
it's not just the harvest, it's kind of how they do most everything here. In some places, people are trying to do as little farm operations as possible. You know, it's called no-till or reduced tillage. And in a situation where you have root crops like beets and potatoes, there's really only so much that you can do at harvest time.
Mm-hmm.
But in some places, people are planting those sugar beets with what they call strip till. And when they prepare the field in the springtime, they're not plowing it all up. They're not going it over it with it many times with different kinds of equipment to get that perfect seed bed. They're only doing that in strips. And the other
Oh,
strips are just, they have the leftover crop residue from the previous year. So that cuts down on erosion. And anytime that even though it's never going to be a perfect cropping system here where there's no tillage at all, we can do less here. So
gotcha.
that's just one example, the strip tillage.
Okay. Cool. So let's go into cover crops. Why don't you tell us what a cover crop is and what the cover crop can do to solve or mitigate at least the problems?
All right. Well, cover crops are they're plants, and they're usually pretty well known cropping type plants, although there are some exceptions. They're put into the soil, they're planted outside of the growing season of the commodity crop. And they're allowed to grow anywhere from a few weeks to several months over a whole season before they're terminated. And they're not harvested. And
So they're
for in
not
our
grown the food product or whatever.
No, and for NRCS programs, that's part of the whole like standard for doing this practice with NRCS assistance is that you may not harvest that crop. If you do, you no longer have a cover crop, you just had a crop. So
Okay.
the idea is that, well, one of two things happens. You leave that cover crop in and it provides residue that protects the soil, and the plants are putting sugars and photosynthates and nutrients into that soil to feed the soil biology. So, and then you're going to have to terminate that somehow, either spray it out or mow it, or sometimes they till it out. The other thing that you can do is put livestock on it and let them just eat it. And that's actually a really good system because as they do that, their manure and their urine go into the soil, and that's like more nutrients and different nutrients and bacteria that promote the soil health.
Okay. So why don't you give us walk us through a year or a season. So let's say we have a wheat field that gets planted, grown, harvested in mid-August. What would happen next with the cover crop system?
That for our cropping systems here, the winter wheat one that you're talking about is really ideal. So, like you said, that crop gets harvested early towards the beginning part of August. And what people could do is come in behind that, not till it up, and plant a cover crop into that ground. And from mid-August until the following spring, like maybe they would want to terminate that cover crop in April.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those months, that cover crop is in the ground. You'd have to plant something tough like winter barley or winter wheat. Radishes and turnips will do until there's a really hard freeze. And part of the research that we're doing at the PMC in Aberdeen is to figure out, what exactly are the good cover crops that are going to grow here that are maybe going to survive through the winter. But anyway, you have that living root in the soil all winter long, even under the snow. Even though the biology slowed down, you have that system primed for when it warms up in the spring. Before they terminate it, it's going to be providing a benefit for the soil biology, but it's also over the wintertime going to prevent that soil from blowing away.
Perfect. Yeah. And then so the following spring, you've got some living, maybe some dead and decomposing cover crop, and you want to go into your next crop. What would you do?
Well, it really depends on your management, and it depends on what your concerns are. There are some concerns that a cover crop could harvest different pests or diseases, for example, nematodes that could get into the potatoes or the beets. So you'd have to be really careful with your management
Mm.
to make sure that you're not creating a problem for yourself in your subsequent crop. And I think that's one of the reasons that these have been slow, cover crops have been slow to be adopted, because there's a lot of logistics to work out to where you don't cause yourself a problem. But ideally, when you terminated this crop in the springtime, say you sprayed it out with a burn down herbicide, and then you went into there with one of the strip tillers that I was talking about,
Mhm.
and you didn't get rid of the residue except in those strips into which you planted your beets. So that's just an example of how cover crops could work here.
Very cool. So, why don't we jump to, what you're doing at the Plant Materials Center? What's the state of the science and the research and where are we going?
All right. Well, recently, what we've done at the Plant Materials Center is we took part in what was called the National Cover Crop Adaptation Trial. And there's 25 plant materials centers around the country, and most of us took part in the same study where we planted the same varieties of the same cover crops all over the country and monitored which ones performed well in different regional climates.
Hmm.
And so that has all been put into reports and is published online for people to use. So you can know for your region what worked, what didn't work, when did it die?
So is
How
that on a like species to species basis, or can you say that certain varieties of a given species are better in one part of the country and not another?
it's both. It's both. It's what species did well. And then for example, for cereal rye, some of the varieties that we evaluated winter killed and some of them didn't. So I have heard from farmers that they think that's really valuable knowledge because if they want to plant that and they don't want to have to go in and terminate it, they know that these certain varieties are going to winter kill. So they just know that nature's going to terminate the crop for them.
Okay, gotcha. And just finally, what would you say to an Idaho farmer that you're trying to get them to either adopt this practice or give it a try?
I think the first thing I would say to them is find a neighbor, find someone in your area who already is into cover crops and go talk to them.
Is
Because
that pretty easy to find someone who's already doing it?
I wouldn't say it's easy, but if a person talked to their local NRCS field office, the service center, pretty much everybody at one of those local centers is going to know of, or they're going to know somebody who does cover crops.
Okay.
That would be a really good place to start. And then I'd also point them to the studies that we've done and just tell them if you're interested in it, try a few acres because you're going to have to, even if you read the research and talk to other people, you're going to have to figure out what works best on your farm for your soils, for your management system, the equipment that you have.
And NRCS, they've got some money that can help people give this a try, right? They're cost sharing or funding it.
Yes, usually it's funded through a more comprehensive conservation plan. To my knowledge, you'd have to agree to do more practices. You know, have an NRCS person come out and help you evaluate your farm and identify what your resource concerns are. But probably for most people, if they get going on a conservation plan, they'll see that they really could be helped by cover crops.
Very
And
cool.
there's a chance that they could get funding for that.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Well, thanks, Mary. That was very informative. I really appreciate that. I thought that was really great.
Well,
Um,
you're very welcome.
all right.